Yeah, sure. I'm just so happy that he's here. Um, I came across his work a long time ago, and he's one of these people who's, he's located in this far off, place, somewhere in the South Seas. Um, Yet his work seems to be everywhere and ubiquitous. I came across him because I'm, primarily a Russianist, and he's written an awful lot on Russian poetry, in particular Drakomoshenko's ties with Hyginian, and now, of course, Prigov. And I came across that work, a long time ago. I assumed also that, Jacob Edmund, who writes on Russian literature, has to be Yakov. Right, he has to be like, and especially if he's also learned Chinese and writes on Chinese literature. I assumed that he was a heritage speaker of Russian, and then I was really startled when I met him to realize that he's actually someone who, actually acquired both of these languages as an adult. Is that correct? Which is quite an amazing feat, and it's sort of unusual to find people who are such dedicated and impressive comparatists. Who also manage from this position somewhere in the South Seas to be ubiquitous in this way that they're always in your circuits, no matter which circuit you're talking about. So like a lot of people occupy their sort of professional skins by choosing one, like if you're a comparatist, you just go to the ACLA and that's what you do. But Jacob seems to actually be present in the Russianist scene and the, modernist scene and the ACLA, and then also probably, I'm not an Asianist, but I assume that he's there too. And it's, I think, just really, I don't know, something about him. He's this incredible comparative scholar. We're so happy and so lucky to have him here. I'll just say a couple more words about his biography so everyone knows who he is. He is from New Zealand. He got his PhD at the University of Auckland. I don't know when. He 2004. He has been teaching at the University of Otago, where he's associate professor. And he writes, as you can already, reconstruct from my introduction. He writes on poetry, Chinese, American, English, global Anglophone. I should probably just say it, global Sinophone, but also global Russophone. We can just make all those three things sandwiched together. He's the author of two books. His first book, which is just an awesome feat, Common Strangeness, Contemporary Poetry, Cross-Cultural and Counter-Comparative Literature, which he published in 2012, which was the honorable mention for the Harry Levin Prize from the ACLA, and also an honorable mention from the Association for the Study of Arts of the Present. And it's a wonderful study of the strange interactions at the end of the Cold War between poetries and poetic traditions and scenes of poetic production, which were hived off in the various zones of the world during the Cold War era, and the way that those encounters were generative, not just in the people discovering new things, but also people discovering that they thought they spoke the same language of avant-garde poetic production, and it turned out that they were speaking different languages. The book that he is presenting today is just out. It's this one, Make It the Same, Poetry in the Age of Global Media, and it's an awesome feat, no less awesome than the first one. You can acquire a copy of it out there. It's going to be for sale throughout the event, and I'm sure that Jacob will sign it to you and personally inscribe it to make it unique and unrepeatable. He's the author of all kinds of other things, the editor of all kinds of other things, but I'm not going to run through all those details. I'll just tell you that the format for the event today is going to be that Jacob is going to talk about the book a little bit for 15 minutes is the idea, so that everyone is brought onto the same page. And then Joe Park of the English department and I, Kevin Platt of the Russian East European Studies department, have a few sort of questions that we can pose to Edmond to sort of start a discussion off, but we're really hoping that the rest of the those present can also participate. We'll try and go until a bit after 1. We'll see how long we go and let the conversation continue. I don't think there's anything scheduled for this room immediately afterwards. And so let's get started. Take it away. Thank you. Oh, we should welcome him.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I don't know after the introduction if I should say anything at all, right? It's going to be all downhill from there, but thank you. You've pumped me up a great deal. I wanted to just say thank you. Is the sound okay? Yeah. Thank you to Kelly Ryder's House, to Al and Jessica you are. In the back, and to Kevin for making this possible, for bringing me here. And it's lovely to be back here. I was last here in 2012 for a great conference, symposium organised on poetry communities and individual talent, organised by Katie Price and other, I think, former students here, graduate students here. So it's wonderful to be back. As Kevin says, I'm just going to give you a kind of brief introduction to the book. Kevin said I'll read a little bit and say a few things about it. So what I thought I'd do is just briefly read you the very beginning of the introduction to give you a kind of taste of where it starts off. And then I'm going to do a little bit of a slideshow and talk to a few images and give you a bit of a sense of what I think are a couple of strands that run through the book, ideas I want to convey. See if we can do this standing up. Everywhere, the same story. Our world is full of copies. The internet is made of billions of pages and files ceaselessly copied between machines. And many of those pages are themselves copies, the products of cut and paste, hard copy, scanning, or remixing. Mashups of other texts, images, videos, and sounds in turn generate the millions of memes and remixes that circulate online every day, producing yet more copies. Repetition is equally evident in the discourse and concrete products of the networked global economy. While science has long relied on the principle of repeatability, the terms iterative and even copying are now buzzwords of business, computing, and design. The manufacture of buildings, clothes, cars, computers, and countless other products involves ceaseless acts of copying that will only increase with the growth of 3D printing and the Internet of Things. These diverse copies and copying practices range from Bach concertos to Donald Trump memes, One Direction fan fiction to modular buildings, and game design to experimental physics. They are united by one thing: repetition itself. Repetition has always played a role in culture, from the reiterated words that constitute language to the intricate rhythms of dance, music, and poetry. But never before have these repetitions been so overt and so pervasive. If copying has become the dominant mode of cultural production, it is equally the condition of its distribution and consumption. Consumption itself becomes production when writers, artists, and social media users alike make their art and their personas through the selection and rearrangement of texts and images copied from elsewhere, whether in a book, a gallery space, on Instagram or Facebook. Such repetitions on and offline also produce the transnational copying of cultural material that we associate with globalization. Make It the Same addresses the confluence of the form of the cultural work with the form of the global cultural system. The book traces a common turn to repetition and reproduction among diverse poets working in 3 global languages: Chinese, English, and Russian. Poetry is a literary genre traditionally most associated with repetition as a conscious stylistic element, through devices such as rhythm, rhyme, parallelism, and anaphora and pun. Poets over the last half century, and especially over the past 2 decades, have expanded their emphasis on repetition. The principle of repetition, for instance, undergirds the widespread use of sampling, performance, translation, writing constraints, digital networks, reiterations across multiple media, and the cut and paste compositions of citational, unoriginal, or uncreative writing. In the field of contemporary poetry, scholars and poets alike have tended to treat these various kinds of repetition as largely separate phenomena, right? People don't always think of slam poetry in the same place as conceptual writing, for instance. By contrast, Make It the Same shows how these diverse practices, from performance to conceptual writing, share a common iterative poetics. It explores the breadth of this iterative turn by crossing the fault lines of stylistic, cultural, and political commitments in contemporary poetry. One of the tasks of this book is to reveal the common cultural logic underlying the seemingly contrasting practices of such poets as Anne Carson and Christian Bock, Kamal Brathwaite and Kenneth Goldsmith, Xia Yu and Yang Lian, Tusiata Avia and Dmitry Prigov. While these poets differ radically in their approaches, themes, and affiliations, They and a great many other contemporary writers wrestle with the cultural condition of repetition. By examining the work of such poets, I show how literature has, over the past half-century, turned to repetition to address new media technologies and global cultural change. So that's where the book starts off from. And from there, I just want to give you a little bit of a taste of a couple of themes that run through it, and a couple of kind of key ideas I wanted to convey working through a rather diverse archive of material. So one of these is about kind of what I'm calling here remixing global literary history. So rather than thinking about doing a kind of conventional account of where copy poetry's come from, maybe going through John Cage or Jackson McLowe's kind of procedural texts, looking at Warhol, his use obviously of copying in his visual work, but also there's use of the tape recorder, Geisen and Burroughs, Lynn Haginian and other language writers, their kind of use of particular procedural techniques to generate poetry, right up to Kenneth Goldsmith and this kind of conceptual wholesale copying. That's one story that's probably more familiar to people about copy poetry. But what I think is really interesting about looking at copying and repetition in poetry is that we can tell quite different stories about it. Stories that don't go through London, New York, or Paris. Stories that instead maybe go through Kingston or Taipei or Moscow. Now, I want to start with versioning as an example of this. So versioning is a really old thing in poetry, so can't get much more canonical in the States than Walt Whitman. And of course, Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass was produced in version after version after version. But actually, the term versioning, which is now really widespread and has kind of been brought into the arts generally, into business, into design, computing since the 80s, originates in Kingston, Jamaica in the 60s with the development of dub plates, so these kind of acetate plates which were on which they recorded drum and bass tracks, over which that overlaid different versions of a song. It was actually a kind of way to save money initially. But then the dub plates themselves, the drum and bass, became a useful backing for DJs, and then they would toast or rap over them. It's there, I think, that we can start to tell also one alternative story of the kind of rise of versioning practices within contemporary poetry. And the person I want to start with here in that story was working in Kingston in Jamaica in the 1960s too, and that's Kamal Brathwaite, originally from Barbados. So Brathwaite's practice starts with his acquisition of a tape recorder, not in 1965 like Allen Ginsberg and Andy Warhol, but in 1960 already. He got a hold of a transistor tape recorder and immediately began composing poetic work using that tape recorder. So Brathwaite's Rites of Passage, which is his first work to kind of make his reputation in 1967 when it was published, was composed through drafting and redrafting onto tape. So it's critical to that work. And it's really out of that kind of versioning practice that Brathwaite develops through tape recording that we then lead on to people like Lyndon Kwesi Johnson, who was extremely influenced by Brathwaite as a young poet in London in the early 70s. And we get the development of dub poetry and other genres both in the UK, obviously in the Caribbean as well, and other parts of the world. So that's just an example of one of the kind of alternative genealogies we might trace for copy poetry. Another would be one that goes to Moscow into conceptual writing in the 1970s and 1980s. And here we get a group that in some ways has conceptualism in Russia has kind of been treated in a couple of different ways, in my opinion, by critics, often as either a kind of imitation of Western conceptualism, since they kind of adopted the term from Western art, or as incommensurable with Western conceptualism, because unlike in the West, we didn't have the kind of consumer culture and advertising that pop art and then conceptual art were engaging with. Anyway, that's been the argument. But what I think is, if we kind of start to tell the stories of literary history differently, we can see, in fact, that the kind of practice of conceptualism in Russia was an artful kind of copying practice which sought to kind of out-copy Western pop and conceptual art. And one of the ways they did this was turning to their own kind of cultural practices of copying, and in particular, what had developed by the 1970s into kind of its own kind of culture, which was samizdat culture. This is an example of a work by Dmitry Prigov, 18-я азбука, Cumin и круги на воде, 18th alphabet, stone and circles and water, and it's a work that uses a samizdat copying technique as a way to generate a work of art. So it's basically 5 carbon copies with the 5th almost illegible carbon copy on top. And as you turn the pages, this work is stone and circles and water, and the text describes a stone falling and striking the water in the middle, and of course the image creates this image of ripples spreading out. But as you turn the pages, it's as if the ripples are subsiding and the text slowly shows through. So it's a rather beautiful work of art and literature that's using this particular copy medium of typescript and carbon paper. Another one thing that I would say about this kind of conceptual art is it's also often kind of associated with this very kind of mocking attitude towards the Russian tradition. This is a great example of Prigov in that mode. This is his version of Crime and Punishment. Student, comma, killed old woman, comma, with axe, comma, anguishes terribly, stop, Dostoevsky. But there's also something kind of loving about this relationship. So on the one, as Kevin actually first pointed out, and I develop in the book, this has a kind of reference to Mandelstam, who also wrote about stone, was a really key image and name of a book which he wrote in several different versions, and it engages with that literary tradition. So in some ways he's on the one hand kind of mocking the kind of fetishization of the samizdat material, and on the other hand he's kind of having a loving attitude towards it as well. And one final example of this is the work on the cover, which is basically made out of handwritten copying of Mandelstam's poetry, turned into these Malevich-like black squares. The other thing I just want to say really briefly in the last couple of minutes is that what I want to suggest in the book is that we can rethink literary history in quite a dramatic way if we, instead of think about it through this kind of ideology of innovation, we think about it think about recent literary history in terms of the artful use of copying. So a whole lot of the ideas about kind of the in kind of some conventional literary histories, we hear about kind of modernisms which are belated, where they're picking up on things from Eliot later. But that whole belatedness thinking depends on this idea of innovation, right, being the driver of things. If actually what we're interested in artful copying, then there's no such thing as belatedness, right? It's just a kind of more artful copying added on top. So instead of making it new in Pound's words, itself actually borrowed from an ancient Chinese text, we can make it the same. One example of this kind of artful use of copying is what I term translation poetry and talk about in the book. So there are a number of examples of this, a couple of US examples. In Ge Li Shi by Jonathan Stalling, which uses transliteration between Chinese and English to generate strange texts. And Brandon Som's Ulipo in his collection Tribute Horse, which is a homophonic translation of a classic Chinese poem, Li Bai's Quiet Night Thoughts, or Jing Ye Si. Tan Lin uses very obvious copying techniques, but there's also a kind of interrelationship between Chinese and English in his work, which comes out in versions like this one, I think, produced here, which is a Chinese machine translation version.
Produced right here in this room.
Right, in this room. And then finally, a last example of a really example I love of translation poetry, Xia Yu's, who's a Taiwanese poet's book, 粉红是噪音, or Pink Noise, which is basically text culled from the internet and then machine translated into Chinese, and you have the Chinese and English text overlaying each other through transparencies. The whole book's made of transparencies. So it kind of produces this kind of image of the intersection of languages and the kind of confusion of voices on the internet. And then the point then is that if we start to think about copying as this kind of driver of literary circulation and change, then we start to see kind of circulations of literature differently around the world. So this is Caroline Bergvall's Say Parsley, the installation version of that work. But Say Parsley, might not realise, it's really, in some ways, a kind of versioning of a work or response to work by Kamal Brathwaite called Name Tracks, which also plays on the Simon Says children's game, right, where you have to respond with the same words, and is also about this kind of enforcement of accent and dialect and the power of different accents and dialects. Or we could take Bergvall's later work Drift, which is obviously kind of a rewriting of The Seafarer, but also a kind of remixed to address a contemporary European refugee crisis and in one particular atrocity that happened on the Mediterranean. And that work refers, I think, back and echoes in some ways in terms of this idea of addressing this kind of atrocity at sea, responds to Norbese Phillips' Zong through 2008, many of you will know, which also kind of works with the kind of disintegration of text to address, to reproduce a text, in this case, documenting the terrible atrocity of the murder of Africans on board the slave ship Zong. So those are kind of two key lines in the book. Can we reform literary history by thinking about it in terms of make it the same instead of make it new? And can we use kind of copy poetries to trace kind of alternative genealogies that get outside a kind of Western European kind of and Anglo-American framework for thinking contemporary global literature? Thanks.
So I think now we'll engage for a few minutes at least in some questions up here. We'll engage for a few minutes at least in some questions up here, and then I'm certain that the audience is probably like bursting with questions too. So we'll leave some time for that as well. What a great book! I just spent the morning reacquainting myself with it, and I've got so many questions about it, but maybe I'll just start out with like a big one. Mm-hmm. And that's about the particular sort of problem of copying and originality that you identify in the book and you deal with. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about, the beginning of the book, you talk about Braithwaite and discuss his conception of copying as something that could be drawn out of oral culture. Mm-hmm. But then you sort of position oral culture and the idea of oral culture as a cultural formation which is dedicated to versioning perpetual sort of performances which are ephemeral, none of which are the same, the sort of missing original. Mm. You describe that as as an imaginary sort of theoretical configuration which derives from the encounter of folklore collectors, basically, with epic literature in the middle of the 20th century. Their realization by sort of sampling many different times that these texts have different forms, and you describe it sort of as an imaginary formation against which Braithwaite is writing. I was wondering, as I was reading that, to what extent is oral literature, in many ways, similar to the poetics of iteration that you're describing. Mm-hmm. I was also thinking about sort of other sort of pre-print formations like manuscript culture, which is also dedicated, of course, to, or formed out of the perpetual copying and copying always with a difference. And of course, in manuscript traditions, often scriptural traditions, there's an emphasis on originality or like original words of God, but nevertheless a recognition that the world is full of texts which are not actually originals, which are copies. And that got me thinking about just the sort of a longer history. So you have a very, I think, compelling revisionist history of literature, which starts with modernism and says, no, what we should be thinking about is not about originality, the cult of originality, but about the importance of iteration and iterability to the poetics of 20th century movements going forwards. I'm thinking, is the cult of originality, in fact, in particular, the form that it takes following, say, late 18th century aesthetics going into romantic aesthetics, is it really the aberration in human history? Is human history actually, in general, a history of poetics which are formed out of a recognition that individual copies of texts are unique and unrepeatable attempts to copy something else? That the particular sort of European conception of, on the one hand, original genius and unrepeatability of the work of art, as opposed to the endless repetition of commodity capitalism, everything is the same all over the place. Is that a very sort of particular moment, which maybe is passing, and which is anomalous in human history? Like, is there a longer history of iteration to be written around your book? Maybe it's the next book.
Yeah. That's a great question. There's sort of several parts to it. I think you're right at some extent. To some extent, repetition and iteration is really, I think, a basic part of human culture in general, right? Language itself, it requires repeatability. Otherwise, we couldn't, comprehend each other. All the words I'm using are someone else's words that I'm repeating. I'm just, putting them in a particular order for a particular occasion. So, to that extent, I think yes. I think to take the kind of specific example and then kind of expand out to the general question. So with Brathwaite in the 60s, one of the things I was doing there, drawing on Hornsaucy's book, the Ethnography of Rhythm, where he kind of looks at the way in which the kind of idea of oral literature was constructed in the mid 20th century through people like Parry and Lord, and that yes, they relied on these kind of new exact repetition technologies to kind of produce a particular awareness of versioning. So I think the kind of particularly kind of contemporary awareness of versioning, I'm pretty convinced by that argument, does have something to do with the capacity to kind of preserve all these versions. That's not to say that oral practice is imagined per se, but maybe that our ways of thinking about it are shaped by the technologies we contrast it with, or practices we contrast it with. And that's not a new phenomenon, right? You can go back to Plato and Phaedrus and the complaint that when people write things down, they no longer sort of think properly. They're just repeating things without really understanding them. So that kind of anxiety and worry has been there a long time, I think, through various different technologies. But I was particularly concerned to look at Brathwaite's work and think about technological mediation because at a local level, because Brathwaite is often thought about in two stages. On the one hand, this poet who's advocated this sort of turn to oral folk traditions in the 60s and 70s, and then the boy goes weird, if you like, and turns and goes to the computer and starts, focusing on technology. Whereas I think if you understand Brathwaite's real interest in new technologies right through his career, and how important first the record player was, he was a DJ on a local radio station while still at high school, playing jazz records through his use of tape recording as a compositional method in the 60s. I think you start to see that this practice of versioning was always there, and it was always intimately connected to technologies. So I think that the more contemporary senses of orality are mediated through those technologies. That it becomes very difficult to this idea of a kind of pure manuscript, but particularly kind of pure oral literature then becomes hard to think about, because even if you cited an example, I think in the email to me, even if we're writing about cultures which do still maintain that oral situation, as soon as we're writing about them, we're kind of at that.
It's a kind of a Schrodinger's cat problem.
Yeah. So there is some of that. But yeah, I think also that you're right that the particular kind of obsession, this desire to differentiate the kind of unique and new from the sort of mass-produced is the kind of evil has been the kind of story of romanticism and modernism that's been told. And yet it's only one side of it, of course, because equally, and plenty of people have written about this to some extent, but I tried to really emphasize it here. Equally, all through that story is also this kind of obsession with the new technologies of reproduction and how we can play with those reproductions as well. And that's part of what I've sought to bring out here. But I think that always, I'm not sure if it's sort of a matter of kind of getting to a period where that no longer applies. I think repetition practices have always been central to cultural and literary and art practices, but the particular ways in which the kind of sameness versus difference is articulated often change over time as technologies change, because it's often with the new technology coming in that we get this sort of distinction between sameness and difference, whether it's writing for Plato or whether it's sort of digital technologies now for us.
Do you want to take a step?
Yeah, so I just want to begin by saying how much I appreciated this book. This is an extraordinary achievement and a superb book. And I want to say that, the conceptual heft of, everyone should read this book. The introduction is very succinct, but it does this incredible work. I think the conceptual heft of your understanding of the iterative turn, it reminds me of when I was in undergrad and got super excited by the linguistic turn. To me, you've produced something on that order, and I think everyone should read it. It's excellent. And from what you just said, I've now in media theory, I've become quite accustomed to readings of that the media is the message, media technology has conditioned aesthetic expression. That's very familiar to all of us now. I think what's really important about what you're adding is, and this is also in the introduction, is that, media theory and cultural production work on each other, and that cultural production has also shaped media theory. And I think that's actually what's been missing in media theory as I read it today, which is I've often find I'm sometimes impatient with, because I think it's not able to account for the place of the literary, and it doesn't want to. Like, the point is that there's no special place for the literary. But I think to understand that kind of the two-directional movement that you were describing is, I think, the real pleasure also of this introduction. And to build on that a little bit, I think I just wanted actually to read a little bit from the Brathwaite chapter, because I think we can see that happen. Like here he's done this, you've done this conceptual heft, but the readings are superb all the way through this book. And the beginning with Brathwaite is spectacular, because here you are doing Russian in China, Brathwaite is not in Russia or China. It's kind of amazing that you went there. So just a little bit from the Brathwaite chapter in your reading of his poem Calypso. Just as Brathwaite's calypso rhythm can only be reproduced through audio recordings of the poem, so the arc is also implicitly that of a record groove traced by a needle, whose up and down movements similarly reproduce the calypso beat. It is also a radio wave connecting a politically divided Caribbean through rhythm. So it's like the way he's done that it's a close and attentive reading, but in a different way. And I think that's true for the readings of Oceanic stasis and movement later in the book, for the readings of the palimpsestic, the overlays of the transparencies, and some of the stuff that you showed. So I just think it's spectacular. And I actually have a version of Kevin's question, which is actually appropriate considering your interest. So I actually had a more pointed version of your question. I guess it's, I don't know, maybe that means we're both here at Penn. I don't know. But, I think there have been, you could make, as you say, one way that people have accounted for kind of literary change is to say everything is just modernism, planetary modern. Forget that, it's all modernism, right? And, and I was thinking I'm working with a graduate student on a project, and he's routed through Latour talking about actually modernism is the problem, as you're saying, just like romanticism through moment, that's a blip that's actually inaccurate to how to understand cultural expression, right? And so I don't know. I mean, you're a modernist, right? I wonder, as part of me is kind of, it's like modernism over, So I'm just kind of interested in that. I mean, we can do it. I mean, you're routing it through a longer trajectory through Romanticism, right? But those particular concerns of modernism, we cared so much. I mean, I've been trained in that stuff too, but if we see that as this kind of, is it better to just bracket off those conceptual formulations? What the damage that they've done is pretty evident, right? And that, like, if we look, like, and there are real efforts now to just kind of ignore that time and go to pre-modern and contemporary, right? And to map those
and apply
temporal
those
frames.
Models
exactly.
back towards like the things that were described as modernism.
Yeah, and that kind of those modernist, particular fetishes of modernism, that's like so. Not that you're saying that, but but also that I've just kind of repeated Kevin's question, but along those same lines, the particular modernist obsession, for good reason, with kind of the hard distinctions between repressive and emancipatory possibilities and the mess of that, right? It's like we're kind of saddled with that stuff in part because of modernism. So, and I think this book is excellent especially in talking about the both of those possibilities in the copy, right? So anyway, you could talk about repressive, emancipatory, or not trash modernism, whatever you want to do.
Thank you. There's a lot in there. I'd like to say thank you for picking up on the kind of media approach from the start. It was really important to me, although media studies has come more and more, I think, into literary studies. I still felt in the kind of comparative literature, kind of world literature discussions I worked in, that not enough was really being paid, attention was being paid to what I consider the really useful media work, which is actually the work that doesn't say, is not this kind of technologically determinist. I really am indebted to Lisa Gittleman's work in particular, and her accounts of media there as cultural practices, not as technologies, right? So their difference being, right, the record when Edison, started promoting it, he thought it was going to be a business tool, and it turned out to be this great medium for popular music. So that was a cultural practice, which then becomes indelibly associated with that particular medium, right? So a medium is a cultural practice, and that's, I think, really important, because then we also, when we're thinking about kind of art and literary practices, it's not like they're kind of being shaped by technology so much as they're actually part of the conversation and part of being shaped by the kind of conventions of the medium, but also contributing to the shaping of those conventions and how they're used. And so that would be true of Braithwaite and tape recording and sound recording in the 60s, when those things are still kind of fairly up for grabs. So thank you for that. It's one important thing that I've wanted to address in the book. In terms of the kind of question of periodization, and maybe I can anticipate the kind of, you're referring also to the question about postmodernism.
Yeah, that was the question I was holding reserved.
Okay.
So, let me just add on to Joe's question and say, so postmodernism, in my head at least, is like the place prior to Jacob, where the question of repetition, redeployment, copying, in theoretical statements, but also in practices, is deployed most forcefully.
Yeah.
Yet the postmodernism doesn't come up here. No. It's not a critical term which is used by Jacob, and where you're talking about authors who might be described by other people as postmodernists, or who might have described themselves as postmodernists at particular times. You don't engage with that at all. So is there an implicit critique of the postmodernist theoretical attempts to describe an insta-modernism as well in this book? So what is the periodization?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So, I mean, I guess I always want to ask, when we're using these big periodization terms like modernism or postmodernism, what work are they doing? And, what are they usefully here, or are they just getting in the way, as Joe said? And I think that is really an important question to ask. So in terms of the book, some of those writers have been talked about in terms of postmodernism. Others maybe not so much. Certainly, if anything, the Arrivants and Braithwaite's early work from the 60s would be talked about in terms of modernism, right? A kind of late Caribbean modernism. So one of the ideas with kind of getting away from that was to kind of avoid that, to say actually if we look at kind of copy practices, then we can trace kind of an alternative kind of period and alternative shapes of kind of development literature which aren't kind of trapped in those particular terms. The other thing I'll say is Roman Jakobson said, "You asked me what postmodernism is, and I don't even know what modernism is." Roman Jakobson said that, who was kind of at the birth of a particular kind of modernism in Russia in the 1910s and 1920s, would say that. Then I don't honestly, that the term modernism has become so capacious these days that I wonder what critical purchase it has at all. Right. So again, I'm not sure. Beyond saying, I guess the one useful thing of the kind of massive expansion of it is to say, well, we can talk about all these things together, and we're not inhibited by periods. But I think we need to think about what we're cutting off if we are imposing a particular periodization. I do think that that's not to say that we don't need to pay attention to the particular historical moments, right? The 40s are very different from the 60s, they're very different from today, as well as they're very different in one part of the world to another at those particular times. So we need to have that kind of contextualization. But whether the periodization helps us do that or just gets in the way is another question. I've written elsewhere actually about the use of periodization in modernism of the term postmodernism, because it has this very kind of distinct history in different places and times. So there's this kind of utopian use of postmodernism which kicks in the States and other parts of the Anglophone world in the 70s. Then we get this kind of Jameson-inflected, very dystopian idea of everything, which is the kind of very, everything simulacrum kind of thing, and everything's the same. We're sort of trapped in it in the 80s. That carries, and then that kind of disappears. And from about 2000, there are various essays. Marjorie Perloff and Susan Stanford Friedman write about this kind of ridiculousness of distinguishing postmodernism from modernism, and the term evaporates from use in kind of literary studies and at that time, even as it goes on being used. I think you pointed out in your email, Kevin, in political discourse, right? It's used for the kind of in a vague way to mean, well, there's no more truth, right? And so it's very, it continues to be popular in that kind of popular way. But this history is interesting, and so in Russia it gets kind of brought in the 80s and used by people like Mikhail Epstein to advocate for the particular novelty and up-to-dateness vis-a-vis the West of particular kinds of new poetry in Russia. And there's something similar that happens in China in the 90s, but it also there gets kind of used in with a kind of strong relativism and quite a nationalist way in China, in ways that we might feel kind of uncomfortable with too. So the uses of the term have been so different and varied and at different places and different times that again, as a term, it's kind of difficult to use, but I think we need to think about those uses in certain contexts. I certainly wrote about some of those uses in A Common Strangeness, the first book, which was particularly looking at that kind of end of the Cold War period. Yeah.
We could go on and on with questions. I think I have tons more, but I'm sure that there are questions out here, and time is moving. So I wanted to give the audience a chance to throw questions at Jacob. Yeah. Should we there's a mic. There we go.
Hi.
Hi.
There's a few things I was looking for in the book, not because they should be there, but because I've seen it in some other recent work on uncreative or conceptual writing in the States. Things about expression, feeling, romanticism. That's a sort of recent turn. So I think Perloff has been talking about conceptual writing in terms of the lyric, as a way of getting out of modernism, postmodernism. And recently, David Kaufman published a book, Reading Uncreative Writing. And your books are the new books about how to think about these things. And so I'm trying to think about how your books are in conversation, even if you're not. So I'm wondering, do you find that these conceptual poems have feelings, that they have meaning? Are you reading them, doing a close reading? Because that's something that was absent from a lot of the scholarship prior to now.
Big picture in front of the mic. No, great question. So I guess one of the larger points of the book was to really not just talk about conceptual writing in the States as this one thing on its own. First thing to note is that it was, very belated, although I want to get away from that term. It comes, kind of 20, 30 years after conceptual writing in Russia, say. And that kind of after the fact kind of belatedness vis-a-vis other is not, usually part of the conversation in the way it would be if it was maybe the other way around. But I do have one chapter which particularly addresses conceptual writing and race and the Mongrel Coalition, obviously things well known in this neighbourhood. And so in relationship to that, I do talk about the kind of rhetoric, say, of someone like Kenneth Goldsmith, as a kind of the sort of utopian complete freedom to make oneself out of any text in the machine age. But I do see that as very much associated with a particular rather than kind of getting beyond individualism is actually about a construction of a particular kind of subject. So I do engage with people like, say, Jennifer Ashton, who's writing about the kind of lyric hero, construction of the hero as copyist sort of figure, which I think is very much part of the Goldsmith shtick there. So yeah, I do engage with those issues. And I guess one of the points more generally is to say that I think one of the really interesting things and one of the kind of attractive things about repetition and copying is it articulates two distinct, contrasting things simultaneously. On the one hand, it emphasizes sameness, on the other hand, difference, because any copy is always going to be in a different context, where maybe there's a change of medium, maybe it's just a change in the kind of place or time of performance, but whether those changes are small or dramatic, they emphasise the importance of context and the way in which even the same words can mean different things in different contexts. And for that reason, I think that there are various uses to which repetition can be used, right? There's no one particular form. Just as, say modernist juxtaposition could be used, for fascist means in Pound's text, but also for very much anti-fascist left-wing means in, say, Louis Zukowski. So it's not like it's kind of politically not neutral, but can be articulated and for quite radically different kind of politics.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
I just wanted to jump in and recommend the chapter on Goldsmith Place and the Mongrel. I mean, for obviously of interest to us here, but like one of the many payoffs of your reading is to find actually a shared formal longing between Goldsmith and the Mongrel Coalition, which might be a bit of a surprise, but I think that's what's available when you actually are attentive to what he's describing as the iterative turn. And I think again, well, I'm just interested in, how the way you describe, the force of the copy as a kind of, it's a trap. Copies are always traps, right? But that, how they can be manipulated or, serviced for kind of liberatory means, right? I mean, you work through that.
Yeah, so they can serve
range.
both liberatory and entrapping means. And that's not to say that because I say that both the Mongrel Coalition and Goldsmith are using the same devices and have utopian rhetorics, that they're using them in exactly the same way either. But to recognise, and that's one of the kind of availabilities that repetition can be used for quite different kinds of expressiveness too. So, for example, a use of the kind of copy device. One of the things that was important in that chapter was actually to talk about the Mongrel Coalition's poetic practice, because one of the things in the 2015 debate that I noticed was that there was a lot of discussion of the politics, the Mongrel Coalition, and there was discussion of the aesthetics of Goldsmith's place, but there's no discussion of the kind of artistic poetic practice of the Mongrel Coalition. So I look at one of their works, but also and also the kind of referencing there to the the protests following the shooting of Michael Brown and Ferguson and things like the Hands Up But Don't Shoot movement, again, which relies on kind of forms of copying and a kind of collective movement which relies on that sharing of the same images through Twitter and other social media and so forth.
Other questions? I see someone back here, and then Rachel. You're next.
I read your book, your first monograph, Global Encounter, Common Strangeness, and what's the comparative literature. With I read a particular emphasis on the first chapter, Youngli. I don't know what is first chapter, Youngli and Flanner. So I was very interested in your model of estrangement as a kind of means that produce creative production that with through the combination of variegated text and Western theory. So I was interested how this kind of opening up of comparative literature through bringing in text from all over the world through estrangement becomes the sameness in the title of your new book. What is the shift from common strangeness
From strangeness to sameness,
yeah, I'm very interested in this shift.
It's a good question. So that chapter on Yang Lian and the flaneur in exile is on this Chinese poet born in Switzerland, actually, but first made his reputation as one of the sort of first generation of post-mile poets to kind of come out of age. He was published in Jintian, or Today, which is a very important unofficial magazine, first posted on the Democracy Wall like 1978 in Beijing. But then he comes to New Zealand and was in New Zealand on June 4th, 1989, and becomes a New Zealand citizen after that, applies for refugee status. And he writes a number of poems about wandering around Auckland, this empty city, this ghost city, as he referred to, because there's no one there, right? It's tiny compared to a Chinese city or New York or something like that. But it's also a kind of, but I read that also as a kind of, so both about the kind of estrangement of exile, but also about the kind of estranging of the kind of flaneur tradition to another literary tradition, to another cultural context in New Zealand too. And so in a way, although that's sort of what I'm interested then is how that can shift some of our ideas about kind of the relationships between literatures, how we can use that kind of superimposition of different places and times, which is a kind of trope of the flaneur anyway, at least in the kind of Benjaminian reading, how we can use that then to kind of rethink the kind of relationships between different literatures and kind of build an alternative comparative method. On the other hand, so it's about kind of estrangement, and on the other hand, it's also about kind of seeing different kind of forms of sameness, but also kind of variation on a form like the flaneur, and how that can be used by a writer and also kind of be used as a way of reading as well. But yeah, it's a great question. Thank you.
And I think there was one question here. Rachel? They're all worth
Hi.
notes.
I just wanted to ask something that may, on my second reading, might be answered. So I'm doing this very tentatively. I think that it's quite terrific that you emphasize practices and not periodization. That was a big revelation, and also the range of texts that you address was also a big revelation, as you said, with Brathwaite particularly, which is so non-integrative to some of our former thinking about life and art. Okay, but I was also interested in something that may become evident on a second reading, which is when you do situated practices, that is historically situated or socially situated, it seemed to me that it might be uneven, which might be asking for yet another book on these things. That is, in each case, within the particular discourse, like Samistat, you point to exactly what was called on within as a response of that kind of production to Soviet censorship or to Soviet practices, publication practices. But when it comes to crossing among the different uses of iteration, there isn't as much comparison of the situation, of each situation to each other. I mean, right. Is that sort of approximately right? Because some of the characters, so to speak, connect with each other really quite dramatically. Like they know the texts of others, and they are reflecting on it, on other cultures. But sometimes it isn't underscored whether they do or they don't. Like, for example, it's really clear after D. Morris's work that Zong is the basis for Caroline Bergval's, or at least an analog for Caroline's work.
Yeah, and I referenced
yes,
that.
and you referenced that. No, I heard, and you did right now. But it would be interesting to know whether some of the other people at different times had in the background some other cultural work from another zone. And just as a point of interest, do you know what I mean? That it was, but...
Yeah, I do try and trace some of those kind of
Echoes
literary historical actual connections. So, for example, so Caroline Bergval's reading of Braithwaite, I think, is important, and she references Braithwaite in various texts. And I think there's also works where you can clearly see the kind of, her borrowing things from Braithwaite. And I think it's partly, she developed this performance writing practice, which was about thinking across multiple media, using technologies and so forth. So you can see her actually taking some of those things, but also to think about questions of kind of power dynamics within English, which is a big concern for hers as well. Braithwaite is obviously someone who'd been there and had been addressing those things in relationship to media and technology. Another one to sort of pick up on the performance writing is that Caroline Bergval, picks up with this term performance writing, which she's sort of given when she gets this job at Dartington College in the mid-90s. But she kind of turns it into this quite well-known practice. And I look at particular historical circumstances that leads that some of those ideas to come into the States, right? There's a particular conference organised by Romana Huck. Something alternatives.
Assembling
alternatives. Thank you. Yeah. Were you there, Rachel?
No. To my shame, I thought.
But there were a number of.
I had to come home from abroad, right?
So there were a number of people from the kind of US avant-garde who were there, and that was where people like Caroline Bergval, I think Chris Cheek, were kind of came to the attention of those people, and this particular kind of performance practice, which then really, I think, was already developing, I think, within that particular part of avant-garde. Obviously, it's elsewhere already in things like, performance poetry and slam poetry in the scene, but it comes more into that particular pocket of avant-garde, partly through performance writing. So I do try and play some of those kind of particular historical connections as well.
I was just really interested in whether the tracking of the relationship to power in any given situation, like political power, where social power was situated, in relation to the situation of production, was interesting to me, and it was sort of sporadic. And the problem with Goldsmith being his relationship to power and to some degree of place also is so different. That in his mouth something, but in another person's mouth something else. You made that clear at one point, but...
Absolutely. I mean, that's the thing about kind of copying and repetition. It always articulates in the context, and that context has to do with one's kind of situated identity as part of that context. Yeah.
I think, as I said earlier, there's nothing going on in the space afterwards. So I want to invite people to continue this conversation, but I see people sort of trickling out. So I wanted also to invite them to continue this conversation maybe in a more informal way. I also know there's more food left out there. But maybe we should, first of all, thank Jacob.
Thank you. And thanks to my panelists, Kevin and Joe. Thank you.
And Joe, of course. I want to invite everyone to also buy a book if you want, and also get some food, but also stay and continue the conversation with Jacob if you have the time. So, to be continued.
That's big too. I know. Sorry, I'm feeling bad. Oh no, I've given you such a long book.